Hello, readers. I'm here in the legendary study of the famous fictional dog detective Sherlock Bones of 221B Barker Street. Mr. Bones, you're here to teach me about using details from a text to make inferences, aren't you?
Yes, my boy. It's simplicity itself. But first, let me deduce a few things about you, shall I?
Well, Mr. Bones, we're trying to do this about writing, not about people, so.
Give me your hand.
Ah!
You like to cook, you have a nervous disposition, and you work for Khan Academy.
Now, how did you know that?
You have a callus on your finger from how you hold a knife. Your fingernails are bitten, not clipped. And your messenger bag says Khan Academy.
Well, and I told you who I was before I showed up.
That too.
But what does this have to do with reading a book?
I correctly deduced several truths about your person based on clues, my good David. Indeed, all inference is making sense of clues. When you read a story, you are constantly making inferences.
I see. Okay, I'll read a passage and then see what I can make of it. An hour later, thick smoke poured up the stairs. The smoke detector screamed, and I could hear Uncle Paleo stumbling around with the fire extinguisher. When he came upstairs afterward, his footsteps sounded slow and heavy. He was a wreck. Broken glasses, black smudges on his face, and singed hair. Okay, so I can surmise that there was some kind of fire or explosion downstairs where the character Uncle Paleo was.
How do you know?
Well, his hair was singed, that's another word for burned, and his face was covered in black smudges, like you'd get from soot from a fire. And there was all the smoke, and the smoke detector went off.
And there is also the matter of the fire extinguisher.
Also that.
I see something else in that passage too.
What's that, Mr. Bones?
Uncle Paleo was exhausted by putting out the fire.
Huh? How can you tell? Where does it say that?
Well, it doesn't. That's inference, my lad. Note here how it says, his footsteps sounded slow and heavy. Why might that be?
He stepped in something sticky. No, he's wearing shoes made of lead.
Well, those are indeed possible explanations, but you want to think of the most likely option.
He was running around to put the fire out, and it made him tired.
So, you were reading between the lines, were you? Drawing conclusions from the text?
I was. So we know for sure Uncle Paleo was tired, right?
We do not, sir.
Oh!
An inference is only one possible conclusion, but is not the only conclusion.
So what are we to do?
The more clues you discover, the stronger your inferences will become. You have to look at what you already know about a character, about the setting of the story, the events of a story's plot, and piece it together from there. You know that fires create lots of black dust or soot, so it strengthens your argument in favor of a fire. And it's background knowledge like that about the way the world works that will serve you as a reader and as a maker of inferences. Apply what you know to the world of the story and make inferences based on that.
And then I can become the world's greatest consulting detective?
You can become like the world's 50th greatest consulting detective. Top of the heap's rather full, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you for your time today, Mr. Bones. Best of luck with your casework.
Thank you. I shan't need it.
You can learn anything. David out.
Today, we are going to keep learning. We are going to learn about supporting inferences about literary text. Just like we learned from Sherlock Bones, that an inference is an educated guess. An educated guess is an inference. We can take what we've read in the text and what we know about the world around us and draw a conclusion about what maybe the author doesn't really come right out and tell us. Take a look at this cartoon. In this cartoon, I want you to see if you can make an inference about how this girl eventually feels about the movie that she's seeing. Read it to yourself for just a second. If you said that this girl ended up hating or thinking the movie was totally boring, you've made a pretty good inference. She starts off by saying that she's excited about seeing the movie, that she's heard that everybody thinks it's good, but then there are some details that support the inference that she's absolutely bored to tears, and actually bored to Z's, right? First of all, she's looking at her watch, she's yawning, and then she falls completely asleep. Those details can help us support the inference that she did not enjoy the movie. Let's take a look at this text to see if we can make an inference in this story. In this story, we have some pennies that are going missing. My question is, what inference can we make about where the pennies might be going? Where are they going? What's happening to the missing pennies? Let's read this together. My family got a parakeet on the very day that we moved into our new apartment. On our first night in the new place, we tried to name our new pet. I wanted to call it Tweety, but no one else liked that name. We couldn't find a name that everyone agreed on, so we agreed to think about it for a while. My father always emptied his pocket change into an old clear glass jug in the hallway. When we wanted money for this or that, he would count it out for us from the jug. The very next night, he tossed his change into the jug. He mumbled, "Funny, I'm sure there were mostly pennies on top." None of us knew where the pennies had gone. What kind of inference can we make about where the pennies might have gone? Well, the details in the story tell us that the family gets a parakeet when they move into their new apartment, and the narrator's dad notices that pennies are missing from the top of the jar. No one in the family knows what's happened to the pennies. Now, here's some things that we know. First of all, we know parakeets are birds and that birds can fly. We also might know that parakeets are really, really small, and they could probably fit into the opening of the jug. Now, based on the details from the story and what we know, could we maybe make an inference that perhaps the pennies are being taken by the parakeet? The one thing that makes me think that maybe that's not a good one is that the parakeet's in a cage. But there's so many things that there's so many details that point to the fact that it could be the parakeet, because no one in the family knows what's happening to the pennies. They're not taking the pennies. And the pennies can't get up and walk away. So what might be happening to these pennies? I think this is an okay inference. I'm going to keep reading to see what we find out. Let's keep reading. Every day that week, my father complained that someone was taking pennies from his jug. We all pleaded ignorance. That means they said they didn't do it and they didn't know what was going on. And every day that week, we discussed a new name for our pet. At the end of the week, we took everything out of the birdcage to clean it. In every corner of the cage was a pile of pennies. That's when we learned that my mother had let the bird out to fly around every morning. "Penny thief," my father cried, and our pet was named on the spot. Ha ha! In this first question, it says, which sentence from the story explains how it could be the parakeet who put the pennies in the birdcage? We want to find the sentence in the story that actually tells us that the parakeet was the one that put the pennies in the birdcage. If I go back up to my passage, I'm going to read back through here and see that it's this sentence right here. That's when we learned that my mother had let the bird out to fly around every morning. I'm going to find that sentence in our answers, and it's right here in answer D. We learned that my mother had let the bird out. That's how the bird got into the pennies, because mom was letting the bird out. It wasn't that in every corner of the cage was a pile of pennies. That doesn't tell us how the bird was getting it. It doesn't tell us that they took everything out of the bird cage. And every day of the week, her father complained that someone was taking pennies from his jug. None of those tell how it could have been the parakeet, but D does. It's because the mom was letting the bird out. We can write this answer we can explain why that answer makes sense by looking at the phrase right here. The text says. We want to make sure that we use a detail from the text to explain why that detail makes sense for our inference. We can infer, and I'm going to put this right here. We can infer that the parakeet put the pennies in the birdcage because the text says that mom was letting the bird out to fly around every day. That's an excellent way to write your inference supported with details. I want you to take a look right down here. What you're going to be doing today is you're going to be reading your own stories. You're going to be reading two stories. The first one is Thinking Out Loud, and the next one is The Glow by Night. But each one of these question sets asks you to answer a couple of multiple choice questions, but then also to make an inference based on details from the story. Here are some sentence starters that you can use to help you write your inference with at least 2 details from the text. Here's a couple of sentence starters. The text says blank, therefore my inference is that blank. You can also say the text says that blank, and so my inference is blank. You could say, I can infer that blank because the text says blank. You could also say, after this one, maybe you could say, the text also said, and then you could give another detail, okay? Because you need 2 details to support your inference. You can use these sentence starters on this question as well as this last question that's right down here. This last question says, make an inference about how Amy feels. And you could use these sentence starters. I can infer that Amy feels, and then you explain how you think Amy feels. And you know this because the text said, and then it also said, therefore Amy felt, and then you can give your inference again. Use these sentence starters to write your inference answer with your 2 details today. Okay? I look forward to seeing you and your work on Monday. Make sure that you get this finished today, and I will talk to you soon. Good luck making inferences about the text and giving support for your inferences.